Hello everyone, today we talk about bayonet charges in the army of Frederick the Great. We have looked at the regimental organization of the Prussian infantry, we looked at her firepower. Today we'll look at cold steel, observing the interesting debate at a theoretical level and then the equally interesting application at a practical one. Revolving around, in fact, the relation between cold steel, firepower like musketry fire, and artillery fire in the end throughout Frederick the Great's parabola. Now, this aspect is fascinating because you understand that we are in the midst of linear warfare, but you will realize now how a military mind like the one of Frederick II considered really highly the essentially a sort of revival, even to a substantial armed degree, of cold steel, not just even through bayonet charges, but still probably from a doctrinal point of view in a very relevant way, as it had never been seen in terms of hand-to-hand combat in the last 60 years of European art of war. We have seen in the previous videos how this mentality stemmed essentially from a substantial aggressiveness of Prussian infantry, of thick ranks, an emphasis on kind of the stature, the muscular force, let's say, applied properly in the battlefield. This stemmed from the needs of Prussia in terms of just not having too many men to just wear out on the battlefield, but mostly, pressured enough to try to pass to this counteroffensive, this incredibly rigid, but as far as this was concerned, this effective mentality on training, order, the objective slow pace of the Prussian maneuvers that, however, maintained this in fact proverbial order and standards on the battlefields. So consider in a broader sense that throughout all the 18th century, tactics for the employment of the bayonet were developed constantly. Right, this was never a time in which there was just an idea of a static warfare that had just to follow any kind of pre-planned consideration. We've seen how behind the theoretical reflection there was actually a prevalent awareness by the same from the side of the same authors, often talking about military men in the first place, regarding the applicability of the whole thing. Many things you see on parade grounds, we've said it, are practically just designed to mostly habituate the soldier to the mess, to the automatic reflex, if you want, to in a way to concentrate themselves on pouring fire over the enemy with the actual rhythm, to sort of distracting yourself from the fact you were being shot at, right, in some horrifying carnages. Cold steel has always scared the hell out of people, legitimately. Still today, we see in contemporary warfare, troops fixing bayonets and charging, with the consequence of essentially a moral collapse from the other side, because this naturally happens, as it happened practically in the 18th century at large, after a substantial fire exchange that had definitely worn out the troops from both sides. And so, while fixing bayonets was the last resort, it's still, the mere fact that you're going for it is enough to show how morally superior you are over an enemy that at that point will melt away without even, having himself reached by the charge and therefore giving ground to the attacker. In the 18th century, bayonet charges were not overwhelmingly frequent, right, in warfare. There was a substantial consensus about the fact that the reason why pikes had been abandoned, why warfare had evolved essentially for half of a millennium towards the direction of guns, of handguns, stem from the fact that these had finally been able to essentially destroy melee troops before they could arrive to the line of battle. The bayonet had been introduced as fundamentally the single most important gunpowder technology, not because it functions with gunpowder, but let's say it is mounted on a gun after the granulation of powder in the 16th century, and it is that stage that basically shows you that yes, that you can increase with this blade mostly the defensive character of infantry, because this had been developing also in function of cavalry. But fundamentally, what makes most of the job, both in attack and defense, is musketry fire. So that's why such reevaluation of the bayonet, especially in the Prussian army, at this point in history, is so fascinating. So understanding what bayonet tactics, let's say, were about concretely in this period has naturally to pass militarily in a military historical way through the relation between theory and practice, between what was thought and in part at least idealized but not necessarily sclerotized or categorized on the desks of private students, and what the reality, the battlefield reality, taught, because hardly any of this had to do with a concept of one versus one, of the bayonet as, as far as the individual soldier was concerned. That is literally the least relevant thing in warfare. What matters is combined armed tactics, is this broader collective dimension, and on a much, a very large scale, as we will see now, of hundreds and thousands of men carrying out that particular attack. So, as I understand, Frederick II was enthusiastic about bayonets, right? And the use actually of cold steel in general, right? In April 1741, he had ordered that all the infantry servicemen had to, we've seen it in the previous videos, maintained the bayonet fixed, both during peace and wartime. So Prussian infantry, and you see it from even the pictures I uploaded here, that's just art, but it's real. It's accurate as far as the Prussians had always their bayonet fixed. This is already an interesting concept because it shows you how the soldiers were meant to be psychologically ready just to use this this blade that is a really effective thing in close quarter combat, right? That, however, they would have not necessarily to arrive, nor hopefully so. However, this ordinance of 1741 was reiterated on March the 25th of the following year, and in the Reglement of 1743, Frederick wrote that it was his firm belief that no enemy would have resisted to a bayonet charge. Right? Naturally, this was meant as far as Frederick had his Prussians in mind, so not quite dictating the concept for a broader art of war. This, as we've seen, was very important because albeit the Western art of war was very homogeneous at this time. Essentially, Europeans fought all in the same identical way, except some very ethnic stuff in the East still. But by this point, tactics were the same, except, of course, there were some differences. That got down to the political and social background of why the military instrument was employed in the circumstances strategically. The case of Prussia is exemplary in this, of the need of an increased quality just because it was a more pressured country than the others. And so there were significant changes. We have seen it in the video the other day about firepower. The Prussians were obsessive about this continuous fire pouring on the enemy, this concept followed naturally trends, as we've seen, practice, theory, etc. So they had a meaning. They had effects that very often were also a bit side spins, such as the psychological reflexes and so on. So the new combat tactic that is essentially coming very close to the enemy without opening fire, then shooting this musketry volley at close distance, and the general attack at the bayonet was in the head of Frederick enough to be transferred in reality, and seemingly even being confirmed by the bloody episode at the Battle of Hohenfriedberg in 1745, when the the Prince Leopold Maximilian of Anhalt-Dessau ordered to the 3rd Infantry Regiment Anhalt to attack the Saxon infantry without opening fire or slowing down the march. So Leopold Maximilian of Anhalt-Dessau was, in this context, we're talking about the son of Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, that had been the protagonist of the Battle of Turin in 1706, that had learned a lot from the tactics of Prince Eugene. We will have to come back talking about him, because there is a direct connection between, Montecuccoli, Prince Eugene, even Frederick the Great, considering the achievements of Savoy. And on this occasion, the Saxon units that the Prussians attacked were sided by imperial forces for a total of 7,500 men, attacked besides by the 3rd Anhalt Infantry Regiment, also by other battalions, for a total of 10,000 Prussians. 10 battalions sided on their right by 2 imperial regiments, that is, other 6 battalions, for a total of roughly 7,500 men. So the Allied formations were attacked, besides by the 3rd Anhalt Infantry Regiment, also by the units of the Prince Moritz Brigade, that is a total of 16 Prussian battalions, that is 10,000 men, just to give an idea of the size of the troops that were involved in this attack. And in this action, the 3 battalions of the Prussian regiment essentially broke the enemy front. This was the spectacular overture of a triumphal day. Hohenfriedberg is remembered for other Prussian accomplishments, such as, for example, the defeat of Austrian cavalry, which is a big deal because the Austrians were notoriously superior to the Prussians in mounted troops. And Hohenfriedberg was such a great triumph that also regarding that bayonet attack, a few really stopped to inquire the reasons of such tactical accomplishment, right? And in perspective, at the time, the devastating cover fire enacted by essentially the battalions that were fighting on the right and on the left of the Prince of Anhalt regiment. We're talking about the 1st Battalion Grenadiers Zidov and the 2nd Battalion of the Infantry Regiment, the 22nd Prince Moritz, right, were fundamentally obscured as such. And this aspect, as we will see, is very important because, of course, combined arms tactics are always the the maximization of battlefield proficiency, and without adequately softening up the enemy, also breaking their ranks just by a mere bayonet charge, would have not made much sense, right? But again, I'm not going to digress on the difficulties of reconstructing a battle, even as a participant of the same. That basically the military historians, the Prussian officers that wrote the account of fact, really were themselves. So this world of theory that we read naturally is more famous than all the talks that eventually that existed about the battle itself afterwards, and probably all these people were much more aware of what had actually happened, right? But Frederick was convinced at this point that these bayonet charges would have been much more of an important thing in the future of warfare. In the same 1745 at Zohr, the Prussians, thus convinced of their doctrine, let themselves being tempted by a frontal assault of enemy batteries located on a hill known as Graner-Koppe, being repelled, however, in the process. Right? They really went through pretty hard moments. However, they were capable of inflicting such heavy losses to the enemy that had abandoned his positions to counterattack, and thus succeeding to seize the enemy artillery during the pursuit, right, that followed to the enemy collapse. So this was yet another situation that shows you how, of course, they wouldn't try a bayonet attack just thinking that they could do it in any circumstance anyway, right? But they began to think it could be more of a successful tactic than it was the case. This example shows how, again, risky the whole thing was, but also how many losses Prussian infantry could inflict on the enemy by bayonet charging. So in these years, the experience gathered from the battlefield could support essentially a positive bias towards the tactics. In the Principes Généraux of 1748 and in the Generalprincipia of 1753, Frederick was convinced, right, that such success could repeat itself every time the commander-in-chief would have essentially wanted it, right? So dislodging the enemy from his positions through this quite decisive advance and cold steel engagement. Now, in open ground, it would be properly forbidden to make fire until the enemy would have abandoned disorderly his position. This was borderline crazy, right? Because essentially the Prussian infantry was being told to advance under enemy fire without responding. Surely, as we've seen yesterday, given the messing up of the formation even during the same fire, because everything was so let's say coincided that after the first couple of volleys, even the same ranks began to disorder themselves with a great issue. Instead, they would have maintained the cohesion necessary to eventually charge in a compact and orderly enough way to homogeneously smash the enemy front with this bayonet charge, but as we understand, also taking severe casualties during the same advance. At least severe casualties were what they would have habitually avoided by just stopping themselves at a given distance and making fire on the enemy in the same way, right? So it was, again, a very aggressive and decisionistic kind of doctrine, counting essentially on the thick ranks, the thick order of the Prussian infantry, this sense of, again, height of robustness that, the first ranks, especially the ones that, in fact, were, aside from the losses, more involved in as far as the same bayonet charge was concerned. So the ones that had to be probably also stronger from a physical way to just chop people to pieces in front of them. But the entire concept, as we will see now, was a clear and reckless underestimation of firepower for what this had fundamentally been designed, how it count to be in linear tactics, right? But Frederick was so convinced of the effect of such attacks that he introduced a more robust bayonet to distribute to the men of the first rank. And in February 1755, he provided the NCOs with the impressive and massive Kurzgewehr neuer Art, that is, a pike 3 meters tall, while the sergeants in the grenadiers companies were equipped the year after with the even longer pike 4 meters long. And the Kurzgewehr and the pike were, in absolute terms, the longest shafted weapons existing at the time in the European line units. The 2 exemplary originals of Kurzgewehr neuer Art preserved at the Berliner Zeughaus, that is the today's Museum für Deutsche Geschichte, have a length of 235 centimeters and 253 centimeters respectively. So the pike, as you see it, is shortened, right, by essentially, as it was done also in the past, by, say, a time of pike and shot warfare, by cutting the shaft, passing from the originally 404 centimeters to the 258 that you can observe. Now, if you consider what this means, it's literally going back in time multiple generations, right? It's increasing essentially the offensive capacity of infantry through essentially cold steel, providing the NCOs, the sergeants, etc., with massive butcher's weapons that were, again, actually functional to the purpose, right, and would be useful in these engagements, as far as, however, again, the cohesion of the units could be preserved. Bayonet tactics, bayonet attacks, functionalized with more adequate weapons for hand-to-hand fighting. Perfect. The problem is what happens before you get to the place where you can afford to engage the enemy with those weapons. This, again, could be in part, it's a relatively small change. As you understand it, this didn't change essentially Prussian tactics entirely in the essence, but it's still a big deal in terms of just the cost of this stuff. I mean, bayonets cost for tens or hundreds of thousands of men, right? It must be produced. It's a delicate phase. Prussia is not much of an industrial country, yet so it's still like a big vision, after all, about what these men have to do. So what did happen concretely after this? Which kind of battles this tactic could be enacted, and with which outcome, which is the thing naturally that interests us the most. Well, the clashes with cold steel carried out by the Prussian army during the 7 Years' War were fundamentally three. The Battle of Neuss, or Görlitz actually, Hochkirch, and Kunersdorf. We will see them in detail as far as bayonet charges are concerned. So at Görlitz, Neuss, on September the 7th, 1757, we will see these battles hopefully at some point in their entirety, but essentially the Prussian and Austrian units entered literally in collision with one another on the top of the Jeckelsberg hill that they had essentially climbed from the opposite sides, so that they met basically at the top. However, the Prussians were properly controlling the Jeckelsberg, while the Imperials attacked the hill with 42 companies, 42 Grenadiers companies, 6 at the head of the column, the other 36 grouped in 3 brigades of 12 companies each. And in a further time, other reinforcements would arrive. So this battle was fought by more than 32,000 Imperials, led by the cavalry general Franz Leopold von Nadasdy of Fogaras, and the Prussians, 13,300, led by, said the Lieutenant General Hans Karl von Winterfeld, who, by the way, fell in the engagement. The Imperials won, by the way, with more than 15, almost 1,600 actually, killed, over 1,300 wounded, and 42 missing in action. The Prussians had more than 1,800 casualties, losing 7 banners and 5 artillery pieces. The Austrian general de Ligne remembered the worst moments of the battle, meaningful enough as far as the Prussian bayonet attack was concerned, because he wrote, "For some moment we were," so these are the Austrians, going essentially back and forth as the crowd in a theater audience. I tried to stop all this by consolidating and basically stopping our men with a barricade that I improvised with my partisan and the halberds of my NCOs. Now this is fascinating, because they could still help. As you understand it, it tells you, by the way, not from the Prussian side, but from still in a general side, how the how cold steel could be employed even as a sort of field fortification. So the hand-to-hand combat lasted just a few instants, given that the engagement transformed itself in a dreadful close-quarter combat. The first Prussian rank and one of our men were so close that the tips of their muskets almost touched each other. This is also very fascinating, because we have seen how ridiculously low actually musketry fire scored on even just 60 meters of distance from the target. So here we're talking about people literally shooting themselves at point blank range. So you can imagine even the sheer effect on a body by the amount of joules transferred inside of it, such by the projectile flying from such short range. And Delin says, and now the action became really something horrible. The barricades, the field, kitchens, the tents were on fire because of the shots. Remember that this even staying shoulders to shoulder often procured when you lit the powder sometimes with the side letting, people getting blinded because they would burn their eye like that. And these flaming objects became a sort of barrier through which we exchanged musketry fire at, again, in fact, point-blank range. For these reasons, the shots produced such wounds, right, that seemed like inflicted by a cannonball, right? This is the degree by which you can think like an 18th century musket dismembering a person by shooting at such short distance. And this tells you how, it's not just about really, in fact, bayonets, right? When you imagine 18th century warfare, you must also picture this incredibly messy situations where there was not even properly an order anymore. Just imagine the mess in the scenario that the guy here has just described, and realize that even though the Prussians were essentially charging, as it's clear from the account, with all this equipment, this idea of themselves in mind, the role of the function of the bayonet, and the emphasis placed on it, still, first of all, they lost, but secondly, they also engaged the enemy in a situation that had a few to do with just, okay, we'll simply, as you may imagine them, just, flat ground, maintaining cohesion, taking some shot during the advance, and simply charging them with bayonets and putting them to flight. This is the messy reality of war that you can also not really, foresee, really, in certain circumstances, because you do not necessarily know how much ground you're going to gain, what's the enemy doing about this all, etc. Now, the Battle of Hochkirch on October the 14th, 1758. The 2nd Battalion of the Infantry Regiment 19 Markgraf von Brandenburg-Schwedt, after having resisted for 2 hours entrenched behind the wall of the church Parvis and having stopped the assault of the enemy columns with his firepower, was finally and completely surrounded. Right, the Major Simon Moritz von Langen decided thus to disengage by breaking the block with a bayonet charge. From the backside of the Parvis emerged a confused mass that opened its way through sword blows or beating with the butt of the muskets. The attack was, however, repelled, and the survivors were decimated by the Austrians. Famously enough, von Langen was mortally wounded himself by not less than 11 bayonet stabs. And this is just, the degree of how, in fact, the same commanders were depending on such doctrines. Naturally, this was the most sensible thing to try at that point, right, if you really wanted to make it out of there. And so even if the Prussians had not had a bias in favor of bayonets, they would have tried it themselves, the same. However, the maybe the optimism which this could be carried out in that sense was paid. You can never really say it, because again, it's a desperate situation and a pretty courageous choice that demonstrates all the the moral force of these men. Von Langen, by the way, would be just identified in the mass of corpses that had cumulated in what would be called the Blutgasse, so the Blood Street. That is, in fact, the main street of Hochkirch, I don't know whether it was called like that because of the massacre that had just occurred eventually, or if that name was still there, would have been a bad omen, definitely. Von Langen was essentially recovered by the Austrians, was taken care of and honored as a hero, in spite of all, because he had showed this kind of enormous bravery just because of that action. However, he died later at Bautzen on October the 21st, 1758, in the moment in which he was about to be rendered back to the Prussians, right? So the degree of violence, the level of, again, also resistance of individuals, because again, you can get stabbed several times, but still standing on your feet. And when you realize, especially like in this case, that any escape route is lost, and you're just opening your way through the encirclement, which otherwise would mean your death. You really are trying everything. And just think about the general deprivations that this man had undergone just during the war, but just what the background, incredibly primitive and brutal peasantry, like of 18th century Europe, that just was not really particularly used to, a comfortable life, or, just laziness, physically speaking. But episodes like this tell you how still, even the Austrians in this circumstance were, appreciative of such actions for themselves. In any case, the last two examples, as you understand, are Prussian defeats that were practically caused by just a failure in bayonet charges against an enemy that was, at that point, if being reached, was responding with bayonets, but at the same time prevailing through firepower in insight throughout the engagement. The Battle of Kunersdorf, fought famously enough on August the 12th, 1759, when having undergone from 11:30 in the morning concentrated fire of 62 artillery pieces, right? The Russian units of the left wing, entrenched on the height known as Mühlberge, were attacked at 12:30 by Prussian infantry. And here the Russians got their ass broken by the Prussian assault group formed by 6 grenadiers battalions and 2 infantry ones that reached the Russian trenches and found himself in front of essentially a mass of men stunned by devastating artillery fire, practically in a shock state, right? A part of the forces of the Russian Lieutenant General Galitzin that commanded the attacked sector escaped as soon as he saw the mass of the Prussian battalions approaching, while the other troops that were too scared to, be able of moving, or because they were, wounded, remained essentially themselves on the ground, waiting to have themselves being massacred by the Prussian bayonets. Right here was kind of a bare butchery. Now, the Prussian battalions that attacked the Mühlberge were around 4,300 men. The Russians commanded by Alexander Mihailovich Golitsyn, were 10,000 men, less half the Prussians. And this gives you an idea of what, right? Essentially, that most of the job had actually been done by firepower. At this point, basically, the Russians were being ran over by the Prussians because they had been psychologically destroyed by artillery fire. Right? They just let themselves being massacred like lambs without doing anything. Right? Just either fleeing or remaining there, just waiting to be slaughtered. So the experience on the battlefield, in other words, didn't make anything else but reaffirming the importance of firepower. Right? So powerful, in fact, that, like in these cases, you would argue it wasn't decisive because it took infantry to go there and take over the enemy, but we cannot avoid seeing that it had literally paralyzed the enemy, right? And so what the Prussian infantry did with cold steel and just the impact, the shock force, was secondary, as Frederick the Great himself had to experiment at Prague on May the 6th, 1757. Because here, 12 Prussian battalions ended up in the killing zone of the Austrian troops that were deployed on an excellent position on the Amolle-Berg. Without answering to enemy fire as during the advance, as the doctrine, that Frederick's doctrine of employment before the war dictated, put them in a quite discomforting position. Let's first of all consider that the Prussians involved in this combat were 8,400 men, while the Austrians were 10,000, supported by 3 artillery batteries, of which the first one counted 24 pieces by 6 and 20 pounds, and 20 pieces by 3 pounds. And this difference, of course, was particularly important, but it's the combination of the two arms to appear particularly effective in blocking probably every, as we will see now, Prussian advance, because in fact the Prussian forces suffered heavy losses, and after a short while the units disintegrated under the musketry volleys and the artillery mitraille. Right, so not even the intervention in person of Feldmarschall Schwerin, killed in action, by the way, and the Lieutenant General Winterfeld was seriously wounded, managed to re-equilibrate the situation, and only actually Frederick's tactical coup d'oeil saved the day for the Prussians, meaningfully enough, but at this great cost, so much that the events of Prague and shortly afterwards the one of Cologne provoked really a wave of changes in the doctrine of the Prussian army. Musketry fire came back to be the most important one in infantry tactics. At the Battle of Rossbach on November the 5th, 1757, it was cavalry actually deciding the battle, and 1 month later at Leuthen, the Prussian infantry firepower provoked the collapse of the Austrian line. And this battlefield experience brought to the realization new tactics for infantry that would be printed in 1759 with the title of La Tactique et Discipline. After the 7 Years' War, such work had a great spread, right? At the Hague in 1770, there was a fourth edition edited by Van Cleef that, in fact, circulated further at that point. So it made school really. In 1768, Frederick II wrote at this point that while once upon a time, right, it had been an advantage to have great soldiers capable of making good use of the bayonet, so in a very muscular sense, by this point, essentially towards the end of the 18th century, quote, the cannon can do whatever, and infantry can't recur to cold steel. Battles are decided by firepower, except for the attack to fortified position. An infantry force that shoots rapidly will always have the better hand over one that shoots slow. This is definitely a remarkable admission from one of the most extraordinary commanders in the annals of military history. I would say really, marking a bit the end of an era itself, because we've seen with von Clausewitz, with other videos about late 18th century warfare, that things were gradually changing. That the second half of the century saw the employment that whenever larger armies with that kind of necessity for tactical synergy, that towards the mid 18th century had somehow been just had been experimented with probably less resources. Here we're looking at the development of the enlightened monarchies, of the absolute state, plus ever a greater concentration of power. So the idea that fundamentally loading one arm over the other could still essentially solve the battle per se was gradually being abandoned in function of not just a more integrated arms cooperation, but especially the increase of firepower as such. So artillery, infantry, what Frederick is saying here is that practically there had been times, like he doesn't deny that at some point the notion of having thicker ranks, more motivated, disciplined, more aggressive men, more robust men would have been able to break the enemy spirit just with a charge, with getting in contact with the enemy, which was already quite old-fashioned for the time where he was thinking that. And that now, instead, with the only exception of of infantry, of siege warfare, basically it's the one that pours more fire on the enemy, the fastest, that is really going to make it there. And this has to do still, of course, with musketry fire, because, of course, artillery, in spite of what here St. Frederick said, with a bit, again, things must be understood. Frederick didn't think that it was just artillery making the thing. He's meaning that just like a few decades later, Napoleon would have proven, in fact, as a great admirer of St. Frederick in that regard, is that artillery fire, concentrated fire on a shadow infantry, is really a great precondition for any kind of breakthrough that must happen through, well, at that time cavalry also would be reevaluated. Napoleonic warfare is a bit different, but the three arms combination was practically the same thing. And that having heavy concentrated fire in a certain area can provide you with the exact conditions for a breakthrough if you have also good infantry and good cavalry. So what I would read in Frederick's assumptions on bayonet charges in the previous decades is definitely still an ancien regime mentality, right? That especially in Prussia was even more brutal, medieval, primitive, and even backwards in a sense. We don't have to think that Prussia was achieving this because it was a particularly advanced country. As a matter of fact, it wasn't. But this proves also that technology is not everything, just per se, that it's not about some kind of strange, the advancement in the degree of civilization in absolute terms, that you're actually also capable of winning all the time. Actually, Prussia risked to be wiped out multiple times and was saved not by much of his armies here, but by political decisions, right? The famous miracles of the House of Brandenburg that, every passionate of the era is aware of. And thus showing what, Prussia would have been wiped out by the French at the beginning of the 19th century, with the same, having in fact remained concentrated, say, if you want, backwards by that point, especially at the time of the French Revolution, and still Frederick's doctrine, right? And that's where von Scharnhorst, von Clausewitz, etc., brought the things to the next stage. That was also, however, the one of the nation state that did not exist in the in these previous decades. So it was just this was states were just mature enough to blossom in that other form, but it entailed also radical change that for Frederick would have been impossible, because Frederick the Great was one of the legitimately most traditionalist rulers of the time, and of course didn't like any idea of revolution, of state as source of law, and say non-aristocratic system really working, in spite of the fact that, of course, there was also a way and effort to contain the Junker, etc., but not to the extreme of the post-Napoleonic, probably the Restoration time. So the world would have been changed radically, brutally by then, and things could have not come back anymore. But in Frederick's time, still the idea that after all you're toying just now with these musketeers that are just infantry, like you would consider still the musketeers and the pikemen back in the previous century, right? So it's not it's not even a particularly refined game, just per se. It's just go and break the enemy line, just with your sheer force of concentrated men rather than guns, right? With bayonets, and so as if they were fighting literally without firepower, because they literally were ordered, as we've seen, if they had to charge with a bayonet, not to fire while they were advancing, which, as we've seen in the last videos, was the norm, right? There was all a system to make advance a platoon firing and making the line following and going on like that, because for a sort of cover and so on. However, the same intuition about the potential of the bayonet is not to be just dismissed as an anachronism or something that was just rolling backwards compared to the times doctrine, because actually the results, as we've seen here, did occur, right? Less often than not, but in some circumstances, definitely that aggression, especially in the early days, was objectively functional. These men could carry that out. The enemy would suffer heavy casualties. Eventually, firepower, that is something that developed on its own. In fact, I will have to make a video about the Prussian artillery at the time of Frederick the Great, because that would explain really the thing, right? Aside from now Frederick's strategy and, generally speaking, what he's mostly famous for comprehensively, right? So we will look at things like the Prussian oblique order, the converging columns of the Austrians, and so on. So that those are really important matters that must be analyzed also quite in detail. But again, the main concept remaining still the fact that warfare evolves in relatively unpredictable ways, right? You can have a general idea, you can have general vectors about a certain evolution, but how operationally strategically, tactically. A certain action is going to take place in that given theater. In that given campaign, that given ground, you do not know, because too many things can go differently, and you have to be able to take advantage of every situation, even through archaic means, right? Which is, again, something different from integrating that just into a doctrine, but in a way or another, it kind of is, at least as an option. Frederick had gone a bit too wild, but it doesn't mean, again, that the same reason why he had gone so was not the same reason why he had otherwise such a successful military point, meaning that, as you know, Prussia doesn't have, it's not a state that has an army, but an army has a state, right? And that's the actual deal there, right? That without that primitive aggressiveness that still believed that just having this tall, beefy, kind of terrorizing man in the first rank chopping the enemy to pieces would be a viable way of winning battles is still the reason why, the Prussian armies had on another level such dramatic strategic determination, why they thought of themselves like, in fact, sort of Superman by a degree, and why this indeed, and I will have to make videos about this, you cannot really have in any time in history a purely geometric, rationalistic idea of war, right? Like Thucydides at some point in the Peloponnesian War said that just by discipline you could win wars. Well, a Roman, for example, would have never believed such a thing. They believed in the virtus and in discipline together in order to win. And this turns out neurocognitively, neurophysiologically, to be the actual case, that you never are a pure calculating machine that just operates without spirit. Moral forces are always going to be the actual fuel and the most important aspect of warfare, which von Clausewitz understood so well after an age in which, say, military theorists had indulged a bit too much in general towards the idea that everything can be settled by, deploying the main right and then the battle's solving her by herself, practically. So we will keep looking at that background because it's really one of the single most central in the history of Western civilization, and to this day von Clausewitz has not been understood even by the people who teach in military academies and try to be, alternative about, because they're complex against him, definitely, and jealous of his accomplishments, but are too stupid also to fully understand what he actually said, also pretty clearly out loud, right? So not really for even a genius to be, to be tasked of sorting out, right? And we would live in a much better world if people had an actual strategic education, which also the most, contemporary military events show you did agree historically, embarrassingly enough, the complete lack of any actual human dignity in the way you send even just troops invade other countries without any capacity. I mean, you want to conquer a country, do it. Okay, you succeeded. It means you won. Politically, morally, military. Certain failures are the greatest expression of cultural, human, and personal inferiority that you can imagine. And this is something which is always catching up, kind of, the rational element and the scientific element and the moral element, that in practice at the end of the day are the same. We're a bit too, perhaps, in fact, rationalistic to accept that moral forces are actually all one with science itself, but that's also another issue. Surely there are tools to understand, to train yourself, and so we need first of all the scientific method and reason, two, in order to achieve this. So the 18th century offers enough food for thought for understanding thing, in my opinion, to the fullest, because again the prejudice is that this was an incredibly standard clock mechanism, precise and immovable system of linear troops just moving a millimeter, not a millimeter more or less, but actually it was a much bigger mess than the same criticism, mostly to the ancien regime, because that's where it stemmed from, has made us believe, and same part the idea that these tactics didn't make sense and that they were just sending men to their to senseless butchery, but it definitely wasn't the case either. However, we will keep talking about the Prussian army of Frederick the Great, and hopefully also the one of other times, because again, all the Clausewitzian ideas, etc., are like connected with us, right? And with every history for that matter. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.